In a silent courtroom, sitting at the edge of a bench, a gray-haired woman struggled to hold back tears as she watched her 9-year-old granddaughter being escorted away by a social worker. The judge, her gaze firm and unyielding, had just delivered the verdict that would strip the woman of custody. The reason? They claimed that Eleanor, at 68 years old, was unfit to raise the child adequately. But no one expected that this seemingly fragile girl harbored a secret capable of turning the entire case upside down. When she finally revealed what she had been hiding, everyone in the room was left stunned. It was something no one could have anticipated, yet it completely altered the course of the story. But before I share this story with you, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any of our heartwarming and emotional stories. Eleanor had always been a reserved woman. After losing her daughter in a car accident, she devoted her life to her granddaughter, Maisie, raising her with the kind of love only someone who has experienced great loss could offer. Their small, modest home was filled with laughter, children's drawings pinned to the refrigerator, and a cozy warmth that made time feel a little kinder. Maisie didn't seem to miss her parents. Her grandmother was her anchor, her safe haven, her entire world. But that began to change when social workers first appeared at their door. There was no warning, no preparation, just a woman with a clipboard, asking seemingly innocent questions that planted the seeds of an unfolding nightmare. They said Eleanor was unfit due to her age and financial limitations, arguing that a retired woman couldn't possibly provide proper care for a child. The visits became more frequent, until one day, a formal notification arrived. Eleanor was being taken to court, and Maisie's custody was to be transferred to a foster family. For Eleanor, it felt like her world was crumbling. She had no idea how to fight a system that seemed so much bigger than her. Maisie, on the other hand, tried her best to keep smiling. Every night, she would hug her grandmother tightly and say, "It'll all be okay, Nana. I promise." Yet, there was something in her voice, a blend of precocious maturity and hesitation, that Eleanor couldn't fully grasp. The day of the hearing was devastating. Eleanor did everything she could to defend herself, sharing heartfelt stories about how she cared for Maisie, baked her favorite treats on Sunday afternoons, and read to her every night before bed. But none of it seemed to matter to the judge, who cited legal and bureaucratic reasons to justify the decision. When the verdict was delivered, Eleanor collapsed in her chair. She reached out to hold Maisie, but the social worker swiftly intervened. And then, as the little girl was being led out of the room, she stopped, turned to face the judge, and said something that froze everyone in their tracks. "Nana can't live without me. And there's something you all need to know." What could be so significant that even the judge paused? Maisie stood at the center of the courtroom, her small frame dwarfed by the cold, imposing atmosphere. The wooden benches, lined up like silent sentinels, loomed large around her. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting sharp lines on the judge's face, whose expression remained as firm as her tone. Every gaze in the room was fixed on Maisie. She took a deep breath, her small fingers clutching the hem of her dress. For a moment, she hesitated, staring at the floor as though seeking courage there. Then she raised her head and locked eyes with the judge. "You think you're helping, but you don't know what you're doing," she said, her voice soft but echoing like thunder in the stillness. Eleanor, sitting at the back, gasped and tried to stand, her eyes wide with alarm. The officer beside her raised a hand, silently signaling her to stay seated. "Maisie," the judge said cautiously, her tone measured and probing, "what exactly are you talking about?" Maisie glanced around, her gaze lingering on each face as though determining who was truly listening. "My Nana saved me. She didn't just raise me, she kept me alive." The room froze. Even the faint creak of a distant door seemed to disappear under the weight of her words. "She did things no one knows about, things no one here could ever understand. But I know. And you need to know too." Eleanor shook her head urgently, her voice trembling. "Maisie, please, don't," her words came out muffled, but the resolute expression on Maisie's face didn't waver. She turned to the judge again, her gaze unyielding. I know what happened to my mom. And I know what you're hiding. The courtroom, previously a stage for controlled murmurs, erupted into hushed chaos. One of the opposing attorneys leaned over to whisper something to the social worker, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable. The judge raised her hand for silence, but it was Maisie's intense gaze that truly stilled the room. There was no doubt, this girl wasn't lying or spinning a child's fantasy. She knew something that changed everything. Maisie, the judge began again, her voice softening into a maternal tone, if you know something important, you can tell us. We're here to help. Maisie took a small step back, as if the judge's words were a dangerous invitation. Her eyes flicked to Eleanor, who now gripped the edge of the bench, her hands trembling. Her grandmother looked as shocked as anyone else in the room. Nana, you think I don't know? I heard everything. You thought I was asleep, but I was listening. Eleanor opened her mouth as if to respond but stopped herself. The entire room seemed to hold a collective breath. Maisie turned back to the judge, her voice steady and deliberate. My mom didn't just die. It wasn't just an accident. I know what happened. And if you take away the only person who's protected me through all of this, I'll tell everything. Even the judge's composure cracked. Her hand, gripping the gavel, trembled before she set it down on the desk. Maisie, she said, her tone laced with genuine concern, if you truly have something important to say, this is the time. Go ahead. Maisie drew in a deep breath, her small frame emanating an unexpected strength. She looked around the room, as though weighing the impact of what she was about to reveal. When she finally spoke, her voice carried equal parts fear and determination. I'll tell you. But only if I can stay with my Nana. Because if I don't, no one will ever know the truth. The weight of her words hit like a tidal wave, rendering even the faint creak of a chair deafening. The judge leaned back in her seat, clasping her hands in front of her face as she studied the girl. One of the opposing attorneys tried to interject but was silenced by a simple gesture from the judge. All eyes were now on Maisie, and it was clear that whatever she was about to reveal wouldn't just decide this case, it would rewrite everything they thought they knew about this family's story. Eleanor clasped her hands tightly, her knuckles as white as snow. Her body seemed to shrink into the bench, as though she were trying to disappear in the face of what was unfolding. Maisie, please, my angel, don't say these things, she pleaded, her voice trembling with more fear than conviction. But Maisie didn't look at her. Her gaze was fixed on the judge, who now appeared intrigued, almost uneasy with what she was hearing. The room was heavy, each word the girl spoke adding weight to everyone's shoulders. Maisie, small and trembling, seemed burdened by a truth far too big for her to carry. Her voice, thin but resolute, sliced through the silence like a blade. I heard things. Things you thought I wouldn't understand. But I did. The social worker, until now motionless, adjusted her posture and tried to intervene. Maisie, sweetheart, maybe you're confused. Sometimes children, but the girl raised her hand, cutting her off with a quick gesture, without even glancing in her direction. I'm not confused, Maisie said, her words carrying an unexpected weight. She took a deep breath, as if preparing to say something that would change everything, and finally turned to Eleanor. I love you, Nana, but I can't stay quiet. They need to know. Everyone needs to know. Eleanor shook her head, her face wet with tears. You're just a child, Maisie. They won't understand. Please, I did it all for you, her voice trailed off, fading as if she'd given up halfway through. Maisie closed her eyes for a brief moment, as though reliving something painful. When she opened them again, there was an unsettling firmness in her expression for someone so young. You all talk like my mom just left one day. But I know that's not true. She told me things before it all happened. Things I never told anyone because she asked me not to. The judge watched her closely. The silence was broken only by the sound of papers being shuffled by one of the lawyers, though even he seemed unsettled. "Maisie," the judge began carefully, her tone measured, "this is very serious. If you know something important, you can tell us. But you need to be honest. What did you hear?" Maisie hesitated, her eyes darting around the room, lingering briefly on different faces before settling back on the judge. "I won't say it here, not like this. But if you take me away from my Nana, I'll tell everyone. I don't care who hears it." The tension in the room thickened. Eleanor looked as though she might collapse, her desperate eyes fixed on her granddaughter. "You don't have to do this, my love. Please, Maisie, I don't want you to suffer." But Maisie pressed on, as if she could no longer hold back. "I'll tell you. About my mom. About what really happened. And you'll see that it wasn't just an accident." This time, the entire room reacted. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, subdued but intense. People exchanged glances, trying to decipher what the young girl was insinuating. The judge leaned back in her chair, her expression now more serious than ever. "Maisie, do you understand the gravity of what you're saying? If you know something that can shed light on what happened to your mother, it's your responsibility to share it." Maisie looked at the judge with a mix of courage and sadness. "I know nobody wants to hear the truth. But if you really want to take me away from my Nana, then you're going to have to listen. Because once I tell you, nothing will ever be the same." The silence that followed felt eternal. Eleanor buried her face in her hands, and even the social worker seemed at a loss. Maisie stood still, her eyes fixed on something invisible to everyone else, waiting. Maisie paused, as if the words she was about to say were too heavy to bear. She knew something bad was going to happen. "She told me never to tell anyone because she was scared." Her trembling voice echoed through the courtroom, the silence so thick that even the sound of a breath seemed deafening. Eleanor lowered her head, her shoulders hunched as though carrying the weight of years of guilt. "Maisie, my love, it's not what you think. You were so young. Maybe you misunderstood." Her voice was barely a whisper, but Maisie turned to her, her eyes pleading to be believed. "I'm not wrong, Nana. I know what I heard. And I know what really happened." The judge, who had maintained her composure until now, slowly clasped her hands together on the desk. Her gaze shifted between the girl and Eleanor, as though trying to piece together a puzzle no one had asked to solve. "Maisie," she said, her voice calm and deliberate, "if there's something important you need to say, now is the time. But you need to be clear. We want to understand what really happened." Tears filled Maisie's eyes, but she didn't cry. She looked at the wooden benches, at the serious faces of the lawyers, and finally back to the judge. "You all act like my mom just left because of an accident. But it wasn't. I know it wasn't. And if you take me away from my Nana, you'll have to hear what I know." The room's tension was suffocating. The social worker shuffled the papers in her hands, trying to mask her growing discomfort. One of the opposing attorneys whispered something to a colleague, but no one seemed to know how to proceed. Eleanor closed her eyes, as though trying to shield herself from the impact of Maisie's words, though she knew it was impossible. The judge leaned forward slightly. "All right, Maisie. You have our attention. Go ahead. What do you know about what happened to your mother?" Maisie took a step back, drawing a deep breath. Her hands gripped the hem of her dress, as though it were her only anchor in that moment. "I heard her voice before she left that night. She was crying. She was scared of someone. She said she didn't know if she'd come back." Her whispered confession landed like a bomb. Eleanor covered her face with her hands, while the murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. The judge raised her hand, calling for silence, but even she seemed to falter slightly. "And do you know who she was afraid of, Maisie?" the judge asked, her tone now more serious, almost grave. Maisie hesitated, her small, delicate face heavy with a maturity that didn't belong there. I think I do. But I'll only tell you if I can stay with my Nana. Because if you take her away from me, I won't have anyone to protect me. And you know I'll need protection after this. The silence returned to the room, but it was different now. It wasn't just a pause, it was the weight of something inevitable, something that grew heavier with every passing second. Maisie lowered her head, as if she already understood there was no turning back, while Eleanor looked at her granddaughter with eyes full of anguish. The room seemed frozen in time. Maisie remained motionless, yet her presence filled every corner of the empty space. The judge, her eyes fixed on the girl, breathed slowly, carefully choosing her next words. Maisie, everyone here wants to understand what happened. But we need your help. Tell us what you know. Maisie's gaze darted briefly to Eleanor, who now seemed smaller in her seat, her hands clenched tightly as though holding herself in place. Maisie opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out immediately. It was as though each word carried a weight she knew would never be undone. My mom was scared of someone that night, Maisie finally said, her voice trembling but steady. She told me that if anything happened, I should stay with my Nana. That no one else would take care of me like she would. The silence was interrupted by a subtle sound, the social worker shuffling her papers, but even that felt deafening in the heavy atmosphere. Eleanor looked at her granddaughter, tears streaming down her face, but she said nothing. She knew she couldn't interrupt. Maisie continued, her eyes now fixed directly on the judge. I know you think my mom died in an accident. But that's not what happened. She told me she was in danger. That there was something she couldn't tell anyone. And she didn't come back that night. Never again. Her voice faltered for a moment, but she quickly steadied herself, her determination overshadowing her fear and pain. The judge leaned forward, her fingers interlocked on the desk. Maisie, do you know who this person was? The one your mother was afraid of? Did you hear anything that might help us understand this? Maisie hesitated, and for a moment, she looked like the child she was. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and her eyes dropped to the floor. But when she spoke, her voice was firm, as though each word was being dragged out from the depths of her soul. I think I do. But I can't say it now. Not like this. The tension in the room thickened. It was as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next move. The judge slowly leaned back in her chair, her expression now tinged with concern. Maisie, she began, I understand this is hard for you. But if you know something important, we need you to tell us. Your safety is our priority. Maisie raised her eyes, and the look she gave the judge was different. There was no fear, only an unsettling maturity for someone so young. I'll tell you. But only if I know I can stay with my Nana. Because if I can't, no one will really listen to me. And no one will protect me. A long sigh escaped Eleanor, who seemed to collapse under the weight of her granddaughter's words. The judge glanced at her briefly, then back at Maisie, as the silence filled the room once more. Whatever it is you know, Maisie, it's going to change everything, the judge said, her voice heavy with its own burden. We'll make sure you're safe. But we need to hear what you have to say. This is very serious. Maisie appeared to wrestle with the words caught in her throat. Her breathing was heavy, but her gaze remained locked on the judge, who now sat in silence. The room was steeped in painful suspense, each drawn-out second amplifying the tension. At last, Maisie broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper, yet resonating with a strength that filled every corner of the courtroom. My mom said that if something happened to her, I should never trust the people trying to separate us. She glanced briefly at the social worker but quickly looked away. I didn't understand what that meant until now. But she was right. You're trying to take me away from the only person who's truly protected me. The social worker straightened her posture, visibly uncomfortable. Maisie, she began, her voice soft and carefully measured, no one wants to hurt you. We're here to help you. Then why won't you listen to me? Maisie interrupted, her voice rising for the first time. The words carried a frustration that shattered the emotional restraint she'd been holding onto. Why doesn't anyone ask me what I want? You all think you know everything, but you don't know what happened to my mom. And I do. Eleanor brought her hand to her mouth, her face pale as paper. The silent tears that had been trickling down her cheeks now fell in torrents. The judge leaned forward, her elbows resting on the desk as she studied Maisie with an intensity that hadn't been there before. Maisie, she said, her voice calm in contrast to the growing unrest in the courtroom, you said you know what happened. Can you tell us exactly what your mother said that night? Maisie hesitated, her tear-filled eyes briefly turning to Eleanor. It was as if she was searching for one last fragment of courage. She said someone was following her. That if anything happened, I shouldn't trust anyone trying to take me away from my grandma. She knew this would happen. And now you're doing exactly what she was afraid of. The weight of her words thundered through the room. The judge adjusted herself in her chair as the attorneys exchanged hushed whispers. The social worker appeared as though she wanted to speak, but her mouth remained closed, her discomfort etched into every line of her face. Maisie, the judge continued, her tone more urgent now, do you know who this person was? The one your mother was afraid of? Maisie clasped her hands tightly, as if trying to grip something invisible. Her breathing quickened, and her voice came out broken. I think I do. But she asked me not to tell, because she knew no one would believe me. Eleanor, who had remained silent until now, let out a muffled sob, as though something inside her had finally shattered. Maisie, please, you don't have to keep going, she begged. But her granddaughter shook her head, resolute. If you want to take me away from my Nana, I'll tell you. Everything. And then you'll understand it wasn't an accident. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. The judge seemed to weigh every word she'd heard, her expression grave, as the murmurs among the benches grew louder once again. The room felt frozen in time. Maisie's small figure remained still, yet her words had already begun to shake the foundation of everything around her. The judge, leaning slightly forward, kept her gaze fixed on the girl, her voice measured but probing. Maisie, we all want to understand what happened. But we need your help. Tell us what you know. Maisie's eyes flickered briefly to Eleanor, who now seemed to shrink even further into her seat, her hands trembling as they gripped the bag in her lap like a lifeline. Maisie opened her mouth, but no sound came at first, as though the weight of her truth was too much to bear. My mom was trying to protect us, she finally said, her voice trembling but resolute. But I think she knew she wouldn't be able to. The judge narrowed her eyes, leaning closer. Protect you from who, Maisie? The girl hesitated, her gaze wandering somewhere between memory and the present moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. From someone she knew. She never said a name, but I know it was someone close. Someone she was afraid to face. Eleanor shook her head from her seat, her face etched with disbelief, her trembling hands clutching at her bag as though to anchor herself. Maisie, this is madness. Please, my love, don't say these things. But Maisie didn't look at her grandmother. Not this time. I remember what she said before she left that night. She was on the phone. She said that if she had to, she would do whatever it took to protect us. And then she left. She never came back. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, the weight of her words suspending time itself. The judge reclined slightly, her expression now one of gravity and deliberation. Lawyers whispered hurriedly among themselves, and the social worker, once quick to interject, now kept her gaze lowered, the papers in her hands forgotten. Maisie, did you hear anything else that night? The judge asked, her tone gentler but still laced with urgency. Maisie shook her head slowly, as if sorting through her memories. I heard the door slam. And then, silence. That was it. But I knew something was wrong because she told me before she left that if anything happened, I should never trust anyone who tried to separate me from my Nana. A choked sob escaped Eleanor, tears now streaming freely down her face. She seemed as though she wanted to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. The pain etched across her face was almost tangible, but she knew she couldn't interrupt. The judge paused, her eyes steady on the girl. "Maisie, what you're saying could be very important. But you need to be completely honest with us. Is there anything else you want to tell us?" Maisie glanced around, her gaze briefly landing on the social worker before returning to her grandmother. She knew that after what she was about to reveal, nothing would ever be the same. "I'll only tell everything if I can stay with my Nana. Because if I'm taken away from her, I know no one will believe me. And if I don't speak now, they'll keep pretending they don't know what happened." The tension in the room reached a nearly unbearable level. Everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting for what would come next. Maisie, however, knew the hardest part was still ahead. "My mom knew she was in danger. She never told me the name of who it was, but she knew someone was watching her. That night, she was crying. She was scared." Eleanor choked on a sob she had been trying to suppress. The judge maintained her composure, but her eyes betrayed a newfound heaviness, as though Maisie's words were unlocking a door no one wanted to open. "Maisie," the judge said, her voice low but firm, "if you have information that could help, you need to tell us. This could change everything." Maisie shook her head slowly, her hands clasped so tightly that her fingers turned white. "My mom was on the phone before she left. She said, 'I can't live like this anymore. If something happens, I trust you to take care of Maisie.'" Her confession struck the room like lightning. Eleanor collapsed into herself, covering her face with her hands, while murmurs swelled among the lawyers. The social worker, visibly shaken, fumbled through her papers as though searching for answers she couldn't find. "Did you hear who she was talking to?" the judge asked, her voice cutting through the murmurs and drawing all attention back to Maisie. "I didn't hear a name," Maisie replied, her voice wavering. But she sounded desperate. She said she had proof of something. And that no one was going to silence her. She paused, her brow furrowing as she tried to recall more. "I think she knew someone was going to hurt her." Eleanor lifted her head, her swollen eyes red from tears. "Maisie, this doesn't make sense, my love. You were just a child. Maybe you misunderstood." "I didn't misunderstand, Nana." Maisie turned to her grandmother, her voice laden with a maturity far beyond her years. "I was there. I heard everything." The courtroom was now completely riveted. The judge raised her hand, signaling for silence as the murmurs grew louder. Her gaze remained fixed on Maisie. "Maisie, these proofs your mother mentioned, do you know where they are? Did she tell you anything about them?" Maisie blinked rapidly, holding back tears. She nodded slowly. "She had a box. She hid it in a place only I knew. She said if something happened, I should give it to someone I trust. But I never did." Eleanor leaned forward, her voice trembling with emotion. "Maisie, what box? Where is it?" Maisie turned to her grandmother, her eyes filled with fear and hesitation. "It's in the basement of her house. It's still there." The revelation hit the courtroom like a bombshell. The judge leaned back in her chair, exchanging glances with the lawyers and the social worker, though no one spoke. The tension in the room became nearly suffocating, as though everyone was bracing for the next step, unsure of what it might bring. "Maisie," the judge continued, her tone heavier now, "if this box exists, it could be very important. But you need to be safe so we can address this properly. Do you understand?" Maisie didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked at Eleanor, as though drawing strength from her grandmother's presence. "I'll only tell everything if I can stay with my Nana. Because if you take me away from her, you'll never know the truth." The courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath, every person frozen in place as Maisie's revelation hung heavy in the air. Eleanor turned to her granddaughter, her expression a mixture of shock, sorrow, and confusion. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was barely a whisper. "The box. Why didn't you ever tell me about this, sweetheart?" Maisie's tears spilled freely now, streaking her cheeks. "I was scared, Nana. I was scared you'd get hurt too. You're all I have." The judge intervened, her voice firm yet compassionate. "Maisie, if this box contains what you say it does, it's extremely important. We need to ensure it's found. But more importantly, we need to ensure your safety and your grandmother's." Maisie bit her lower lip, her fingers gripping the hem of her dress so tightly they turned white. She gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to convey the gravity of her understanding. "The box is in the basement, under the floorboards. There's a loose plank near her desk. That's where she hid everything." The opposing lawyer began scribbling furiously in his notebook, while the social worker sat motionless, her hands clutching the papers she'd been holding, too stunned to interject. Eleanor lowered her head, the weight of guilt etched deeply into her hunched shoulders, her anguish mirrored in Maisie's tear-streaked face. "Maisie," the judge continued, her tone gentle but direct, "we will take care of this. But I need you to be absolutely truthful. Are you certain about what's in that box? Did your mother tell you what she was hiding?" Maisie nodded slowly, her voice soft but weighted with certainty. "She said it was papers. Things that proved something bad. I didn't understand what it was at the time, but I knew she was scared. I knew it wasn't just in her head." Eleanor finally lifted her gaze, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "If this is true, if my daughter really knew something was wrong, why didn't anyone listen to her? Why didn't anyone help her?" Her voice cracked, carrying a pain that no one in the room could possibly fathom. The judge didn't respond immediately. Her expression betrayed something beyond professionalism, empathy, perhaps. But she also understood that this moment called for more than words of comfort. "We will investigate this immediately," the judge declared, looking pointedly at the attorneys and the social worker. "Until this matter is resolved, Maisie will not be removed from her grandmother's custody." Eleanor exhaled audibly, as if her spirit had been granted a momentary reprieve. But she knew, as did everyone present, that this was only the beginning. What Maisie had revealed was just the tip of something far more profound, something that could alter everything they thought they knew. Even with the temporary decision to let Maisie remain with Eleanor, the atmosphere in the room was heavy with unspoken tension. Eleanor wiped her eyes, but the concern etched into her features was unrelenting. Maisie, now silent, clutched her dress tightly, her small hands trembling. Her eyes stayed fixed on the judge, though they seemed to peer beyond her, into the unknown consequences of what she had shared. She understood that every word she had spoken would be questioned, but there was no turning back now. "We will send a team to recover the box immediately," the judge announced, her voice steady and authoritative. "But Maisie, in the meantime, your safety is our priority. Is there anything else you remember from that night that you need to tell us?" Maisie shook her head slowly, her brows knitting together as she reached into her memories. "My mom just wanted me to be safe. She told me not to trust anyone who tried to take me away from my Nana." The judge took a deep breath, glancing at the lawyers who were now whispering among themselves before turning her attention to the social worker. "Until this investigation is complete, Maisie will remain in Eleanor's care. We cannot ignore what has been revealed here today." The social worker hesitated but nodded reluctantly. Meanwhile, Eleanor sat rigid, her mind racing. Every word Maisie spoke was like a blade cutting through wounds she thought had healed long ago. "I didn't know my daughter was so scared," Eleanor murmured, almost to herself. "If I had known, if she had told me." Maisie turned to her grandmother, her vulnerable expression softening the weight of the room. "She just wanted to protect us. She didn't want you to worry. But now you need to know." The judge raised a hand to regain control of the room. "Very well. We will treat this matter with the seriousness it deserves. Maisie, you did the right thing by telling us. But I want you to understand, this won't be easy. Are you prepared for what might happen next? Maisie didn't answer immediately. Her eyes shifted to Eleanor, then back to the judge. I just want to stay with my Nana. That's all that matters. In that moment it was clear to everyone present that Maisie's revelation was just the beginning of something much larger, a truth that could no longer be ignored. The courtroom seemed like a distant memory as the investigation shifted to the house where Maisie had lived with her mother. In the dimly lit basement, the faint, flickering light cast long shadows as two investigators carefully followed the girl's directions. The creak of loose floorboards echoed in the empty space, and each sound of wood being pried loose made the second stretch unbearably. There it was. A worn, dust-covered box, its corners frayed by time. One of the investigators reached out cautiously, lifting the box and placing it on a makeshift table. Outside, Eleanor and Maisie stood silently, waiting with bated breath, while the judge, now present, observed with a clinical focus. The investigator opened the lid, and the air seemed to grow even heavier, thick with the musty scent of the basement and the gravity of the moment. Inside were a stack of aged papers and a small sealed envelope. Wearing gloves, the investigator began examining the contents. There were photographs, receipts, and a handwritten letter in Maisie's mother's delicate script. Maisie tightened her grip on Eleanor's hand. "That's it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's what she wanted me to protect." The judge stepped closer, accepting one of the documents the investigator handed her. Her eyes scanned the page quickly, her expression shifting from neutral to deeply serious. The papers revealed evidence of suspicious financial transactions linked to a name no one in the room expected. This can't be true," the judge murmured, glancing over at Maisie. "It is," Maisie said firmly, her voice stronger now. "My mom knew. That's why she was scared." Eleanor's trembling grew more pronounced, her mind struggling to process the enormity of what was unfolding. "What are you talking about? Who was this person?" Before anyone could answer, the investigator held up the sealed envelope and carefully opened it. Inside was another letter, this one containing detailed instructions from Maisie's mother. The words were clear, direct, and deeply unsettling. She knew something was wrong and explicitly named a powerful figure involved in illegal activities, someone who had threatened both her and her daughter. The judge froze, holding the letter as though it were burning her hands. She exchanged a grim look with the investigators before turning to Eleanor. Maisie's mother was dealing with something much bigger than we imagined. Maisie tugged at her grandmother's sleeve, her voice trembling with both fear and resolve. "I told you, Nana. I told you she knew something bad was going to happen." The investigator handed more papers to the judge, whose demeanor shifted noticeably. This was no longer just a courtroom matter, it had become personal. Maisie watched intently, still clutching Eleanor's hand, as the breeze outside rustled dry leaves around them. The judge laid the final document on the makeshift table and took a deep breath before speaking. The papers outline a series of illegal transactions connected to someone named Richard M. Colson. Her voice faltered briefly as she looked directly at the social worker, who seemed frozen in place. "And that name happens to match the director of the agency responsible for your case." Eleanor's eyes widened in disbelief, and Maisie's grip on her hand tightened. "What does that mean?" Eleanor asked, her voice taut with tension. The social worker tried to interject. "This must be some kind of mistake. There's no way." The judge raised a hand, silencing her. "There's no mistake. These documents are clear. Colson was involved in illegal activities, and Maisie's mother knew too much. He saw her as a threat." A heavy silence fell over the group. Maisie finally broke it, her small voice steady with conviction. "I knew she was scared of someone. Now I know who." Eleanor staggered back a step, as if the words had physically struck her. "Are you saying, he's responsible for what happened to my daughter?" The judge didn't answer immediately, but her expression was enough. Turning to the investigator, she gave firm instructions to launch a full criminal investigation. Then, unexpectedly, the social worker began to cry. "I didn't know it would go this far. They told me it was just to make things difficult for her, that Maisie would be better off in another home." Her voice cracked. "I didn't know he would do something like this. I was just following orders." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice now brimming with fury. "You knew they were trying to take my granddaughter away, and you said nothing? How could you do this?" Before the social worker could respond, the judge intervened again, her voice authoritative. "This is no longer a family court matter. This is a criminal case, and it will be handled as such." Maisie looked up at the judge, her eyes still glistening with tears but her voice resolute. "My mom just wanted to protect us. She did everything she could." The judge regarded her for a moment before turning to Eleanor. "You and Maisie will stay together. Not just for now, permanently. This court guarantees it. You've both endured more than enough, and what Maisie has done today will help ensure that others don't face the same injustice." Eleanor dropped to her knees, pulling Maisie into a tight embrace. Tears flowed freely now, but there was relief mixed with the pain. Maisie rested her head on her grandmother's shoulder as the judge instructed the documents to be taken as evidence and the responsible parties brought to justice. When the case finally ended, Maisie and Eleanor walked out hand in hand, their bond stronger than ever. Maisie's bravery had not only secured her place with her grandmother but also uncovered a truth many had tried to bury. Her mother had been right, the strength Maisie found in Eleanor's love had illuminated a path through the darkest of times. Would you do everything in your power to protect your grandchildren? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for another emotional story coming up next. See you there.